The rain was no longer water. It was a thin, icy needle stitching despair into Aisha's thin coat. Each drop that trickled down her face was salty, a mixture of dirty city water and the tears she stubbornly tried to swallow. Her feet, inside her wet shoes that had already lost their shape, ached as if filled with shards of glass. She tightened her arm around Yasmin, her 5-year-old daughter, trying to shield the little girl from the biting wind coming from the corner. The child, wrapped in a small, worn coat, trembled silently, her large brown eyes seeming to occupy half her pale face. "Just a little more, Habibti, just a little more," Aisha whispered, more to herself than to her daughter. The voice was a thread of hope in a tangle of exhaustion. She looked at the crumpled envelope in her free hand. The address, written in Arabic by a kind man at the shelter, seemed to dance before her tired eyes. It was the last thread she clung to. A room. A roof. Something other than the hard floor of the overcrowded shelter, or the wet park bench of a train station. All she possessed was inside the old, faded backpack on her back. Some clothes, documents that told a story of escape and loss, and a faded photograph of a smiling man, a smile Yasmin could barely remember. The war had taken him, just as it had taken her home in Marrakesh, her parents, her life. What remained was this gray and rainy refuge, a European city that greeted her with indifference and coldness. Each step was a battle against despair. She remembered the crossing on the overcrowded boat, the constant fear, the hunger that was an old companion. All this to arrive here at this corner, with the rain falling relentlessly, and the address of a room that perhaps didn't even exist. She stopped, breathless, leaning against the rough wall of a building. Her strength was fading. Yasmin rested her head on her hip, a small gesture of trust that broke Aisha's heart. How could she fail? How could she admit that perhaps she wasn't strong enough? It was then that she looked up, wiping the rain from her face with the back of her trembling hand. And it was then that she saw him. A man. He was standing under the awning of a small bakery across the street, holding a bag of bread. It wasn't his appearance that captivated her, it was his smile. He wasn't smiling at her, but at someone inside the shop, a wide, genuine smile that reached his eyes, creating small wrinkles of kindness around them. It was a smile she hadn't seen in years. It was a smile that belonged to a world she thought had disappeared forever. A world where people were happy, safe, where a simple warm loaf of bread wasn't a luxury, but a routine. That smile, full of simple and pure humanity, hit Aisha like a punch to the chest. It wasn't envy, nor anger. It was a longing so deep, so sharp, that she felt her legs weaken. That smile was the antithesis of everything she had experienced in the last 2 years. It was a beacon in the midst of her own personal storm. For a moment, everything stopped. The rain, the cold, the pain in her feet, the fear in her heart. Everything dissolved before that simple, powerful, overwhelming gesture of human joy. It reminded her that kindness still existed. That happiness was still possible. And that glimmer of hope, ironically, was what finally broke her resistance. A warm tear escaped, mingling with the cold rainwater. She was exhausted, yes. But that smile, however brief and distant, had rekindled an almost extinguished ember within her. It took her breath away, but it also anchored her. There was beauty in this world. There was kindness. She needed to believe in that. For Yasmin. With a deep sigh, Aisha straightened her shoulders. She grasped her daughter's small, cold hand. "Come on, Yasmin," he said, his voice a little firmer. "Let's find our new home." She gave one last look at the man, who was now disappearing down the street, carrying his bread and his smile. That moment, that instant of stolen beauty, became her fuel. She crossed the street, the address crumpled tightly in her hand, heading towards the unknown, but now with a fragment of renewed courage, an unintentional gift from a stranger in the rain. The building Aisha headed toward was as gray and resigned as the sky above. Paint peeled from the facade like diseased skin, revealing layers of grime and neglect. Each step of the narrow, dimly lit staircase creaked a lament, a protest against its added weight. The smell was a heavy mixture of cooked cabbage, mold, and ancient loneliness. Yasmin clung to her leg, her wide eyes taking in every shadow, every strange noise that came from behind the closed doors. Aisha counted the numbers on the doors, her heart pounding in a rapid, erratic rhythm. 3, 5, 7. There it was. Number 9. The door was solid, dark wood, with locks that looked old and wary. She took a deep breath, the air heavy with the smell of the hallway filling her lungs. This was the door. The door to a beginning. Or to another disappointment. She raised her hand, her knuckles aching and cracked from the cold, and knocked. The sound echoed in the empty hallway, a hollow, lonely sound. Nothing. The wait was agonizing. She could hear the ticking of a distant clock, marking the passage of seconds that felt like hours. Yasmin looked up, her face a silent question mark. Aisha forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Everything will be all right, Habibti. She knocked again, harder this time, the pain in her fingers a small price to pay for a roof over her head. Finally, a shuffling sound came from inside. The lock creaked, and the door opened a few inches, held by a security chain. A single eye, blue and cold as ice, stared down at them. The landlady. Aisha could only see a fragment of her face, a thin, tight mouth, devoid of warmth. Yes. The voice was harsh, laden with distrust. Aisha, her hands trembling, held out the crumpled envelope. Mrs. Muller? I came, about the room. They said in the center. The woman took the paper, her bony fingers touching Aisha's for a second, an icy touch. She read, her lips moving silently. The advance? She asked, without lifting her eyes from the paper. Aisha felt a chill down her spine. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat, searching for the small cloth pouch where she kept what little she had. She counted the bills, a handful of money representing weeks of desperate savings, skipped meals, silent humiliations. She held them out through the gap. The woman took the money, counted it with impressive speed, and then made a noise with her tongue, a sound of disdain. It's only for a week. And no noise. No visitors. And the child. She cast a piercing glance at Yasmin, who hid behind her mother's leg. The child doesn't make a mess. Understood? Aisha merely nodded, shame and relief mingling in her chest like a bitter potion. The chain was removed, and the door swung open, revealing a dark hallway and a tall, thin woman with a face that seemed carved from granite. She didn't smile. She simply nodded for them to enter. The room was even smaller than Aisha had imagined. A single bed with a thin mattress, a wobbly chair, a small sink with a tap that dripped slowly and steadily. A single window overlooked a dark and dreary inner courtyard. But it was dry. It was a roof. It was a safe haven. Aisha put her backpack down, her whole body trembling with exhaustion, and the tension finally dissipating. Yasmin rushed to the bed, sitting on the edge, her feet barely touching the floor. The woman, Mrs. Muller, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. The shower is at the end of the hall. 10 minutes maximum. The heater doesn't work properly. The kitchen can't be used after 8. Each rule was a stab in the back, a reminder of her precarious situation. Aisha simply nodded again, her fighting spirit exhausted. When the door closed and the sound of the key turning in the lock echoed in the small space, Aisha slumped into the chair. The silence of the room was oppressive, broken only by the constant drip, 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 of the tap and Yasmin's soft breathing. She looked at her daughter, who was already beginning to fall asleep, exhausted, curled up in the cold bed. The reality of her new home fell upon her like a damp blanket. She was alone. Totally and completely alone in a strange country, with a daughter to raise, a precarious roof over their heads, and a handful of coins in her pocket. The image of the man's smile on the street returned to her mind, a ghost of warmth amidst that desert of cold. How could something so simple seem so distant? She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the gray courtyard below. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy, promising more. She was trapped. But, looking at her sleeping daughter, she knew she couldn't give up. That dark room and the wobbly chair were her foundations now. And from those foundations, however fragile, she would have to rebuild a life. The battle was far from over. It had merely changed scenery. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a pale gray glow that barely penetrated the inner courtyard. The cold of the room had seeped into Aisha's bones during the night, a damp chill that the thin blanket couldn't ward off. Yasmin awoke with a silent sob, her little fingers blue with cold. "Mother, I'm hungry," she whispered, her small, broken voice echoing in the empty room. The phrase, so simple, was a direct blow to Aisha's heart. She opened her backpack, her hands rummaging through the meager contents. A piece of dry bread, hard as a rock, and a small, withered apple. That was all that remained. She broke the bread in half, giving the larger piece to Yasmin, and peeled the apple with her fingers, offering the juiciest pieces to her daughter. She herself ate the crust of the bread and the core of the apple, chewing slowly, feeling the hunger gnaw at her insides like a small, persistent animal. The sound of the dripping tap was torture. Drip, drip, drip. How could water be so abundant and yet her life so barren? She knew the money she had left was a joke. It wouldn't last a week, let alone pay the next rent. The shelter only offered the bare minimum, and the bare minimum wasn't enough. She needed work. Any work. But how? Her French was reasonable, her Arabic fluent, but her understanding of the local language was still rudimentary, a jumble of confused sounds. The fear of being exploited or worse, deported, was a constant weight on her shoulders. She looked at Yasmin, who was licking her fingers, still hungry. The decision formed within her, not as a choice, but as a single road in a desert. She would have to sell the only thing of value she had left. The shawl. It wasn't just any shawl. It was made of the finest wool, hand-woven by her grandmother in Marrakesh. A whirlwind of vibrant colors, crimson, saffron, deep blue, that told the story of her people, of the desert sun, of the noisy, vibrant markets. It was the last tangible piece of her past, of her home. Wrapping it around her shoulders was like carrying a hug from her grandmother, a piece of Moroccan warmth. But hugs didn't nourish her daughter. Memories didn't pay the rent. With trembling hands, she took the shawl from her backpack, unwrapping it with a silent reverence. The threads were soft and familiar beneath her fingers. She brought it to her face, breathing deeply, searching for a trace of the scent of spices and sun, but all she felt was the mustiness of the room. Yasmin looked, her eyes wide. "Mommy, your shawl is beautiful." Aisha forced a smile. "Yes, Habibti. Very beautiful." She folded the shawl carefully, each fold a small stab in her heart. It was just a piece of fabric, she tried to convince herself. But it was her piece of fabric. Her identity. Her history. And now, it would be her salvation. She stood up, her knees weak. "Let's go for a walk, Yasmin. Let's explore the city." The girl, excited at the prospect, took her mother's hand. They left the room, the sound of the key turning in the lock ringing like a sentence. The city, now rainless, was a whirlwind of sounds and movements that Aisha couldn't decipher. She walked, her gaze searching for a place, any place where she could sell the shawl. A pawn shop? A flea market? She didn't know. Every person who passed her, wrapped in their warm coats with their shopping bags, was a reminder of her exclusion. She was a ghost, invisible, walking on the edge of a world that functioned without her. Finally, she saw a small square with a few stalls. A street market. Her heart raced. Maybe there. She approached a stall selling used clothes, colorful fabrics hanging from the ceiling. The man behind the counter, with a large mustache and a dirty apron, looked at her disinterestedly. Aisha held out the shawl, her hands visibly trembling. "Sir, please, how much?" She couldn't find the right words. The man took the shawl, examining it with a critical, professional look. He rubbed the fabric between his fingers, frowning. "Old. Faded colors. A lot of things like this come along." He tossed the shawl back to her on the counter, as if it were a rag. "I don't care." The pain of rejection was as physical as the hunger. She took the shawl, holding it against her chest, feeling tears burn her eyes. Despair began to rise, a metallic taste in her mouth. She was about to turn away, defeated, when her eyes met someone else's. An older man with a kind face, at a fruit and vegetable stall just ahead. He watched her, his gaze different. It wasn't pity, nor disdain. It was curiosity, perhaps understanding. He saw the woman, the child, the colorful shawl, the pain etched on her face. And in her eyes, Aisha saw a reflection of that same humanity she had seen in the man's smile in the rain. It was an instant, just an instant, but it was enough to stop her from collapsing right there, in the middle of the square. She moved away from the clothing stall, pulling Yasmin with her. There were other stalls. Other people. She couldn't give up. Yasmin's hunger was greater than her pride, greater than her pain. She would continue. Aisha walked through the square, each step an effort. The shawl, now an anchor of shame and hope, was pressed tightly against her chest. She spotted another stall, this time selling antiques and trinkets. The vendor, a young man with headphones, didn't even glance at her. Despondency weighed heavily on his shoulders. Yasmin gently tugged at the hem of her coat. "Mother, can I have an apple?" She pointed to the older man's fruit stall. The stall was an oasis of color in the gray square. Perfect piles of bright red apples, bunches of sun-yellow bananas, green vegetables that looked as if washed by the rain itself. The sweet aroma of the ripe fruit was torture for her hungry senses. The man, the same one who had been watching her, was carefully arranging a pile of oranges. He wore a simple straw hat and a green apron. His movements were calm, precise. When he raised his eyes and fixed them on her, Aisha felt trapped. There was no escape. She approached, her voice a whisper. "Sir, please, my shawl, it's my grandmother's, it's all I have." Her words came out in a mixture of French and Arabic, a tangle of despair. She held out the shawl, her trembling hands making the vibrant colors dance. The man, whose name she would later read on a small sign, Jean-Pierre, didn't take the shawl immediately. He looked at her. He really looked at her. He saw the exhaustion in Aisha's deep eyes, the pallor of Yasmin's face, the desperate dignity in her posture. His gaze swept over the shawl, not with the critical gaze of the other vendor, but with the gaze of an admirer. He saw the quality of the work, the story woven into each thread. Then, his eyes turned to Yasmin, who stared at the apples with absolute concentration, her little tongue licking her parched lips. Jean-Pierre didn't say a word. He turned, picked up a paper bag and began to fill it. 1, 2, 3 red, polished apples. A bunch of bananas. A handful of purple, juicy figs. A small loaf of bread, still warm, which he took from a basket covered with a cloth. He filled the bag until it was almost bursting. Then he turned and held it out to Aisha. She froze, confused. "No. I don't have any money," she stammered, clutching her shawl tighter. Jean-Pierre shook his head slowly. A soft, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was a different smile from the man in the rain, a smile of understanding, of silent solidarity. "For the child," he said, in slow, clear French. He gestured with his head toward Yasmin. "Take it." Aisha felt tears welling up, uncontrollable this time. She wasn't crying from pity, but from a relief so profound it made her weak. It was the first time since she had arrived that someone had treated her not as a problem, a nuisance, or an opportunity for profit, but as a human being. A pure gesture, devoid of any self-interest. She shook her head, trying to refuse, but her hands, moving of their own accord, picked up the heavy bag. The warmth of the bread seeped through the paper, warming her cold fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion.
shukran 星号.
Jean-Pierre nodded, his smile deepening slightly. Then, his eyes fell again on the shawl. He reached out and gently touched the edge, his finger caressing the intricate pattern. "It's beautiful," he said. "Very beautiful. Keep it." Those 2 words, "keep it," were the greatest gift of all. He wasn't just giving her food. He was restoring her dignity, her history. He was telling her that her past had value, that she wasn't just a commodity to be exchanged for bread. Aisha couldn't speak. She simply bowed her head in a gesture of profound gratitude, holding the food bag in one hand and the precious shawl in the other. Yasmin, noticing the change, gave a small jump. "Apples, mother." Aisha forced a smile through her tears. "Yes, Habibti. Apples." She turned and began to walk away from the stall, her legs weak, but her heart incredibly lighter. She looked back one last time. Jean-Pierre was already attending to another customer, his face turned to his quiet routine. But that single act of kindness resonated within Aisha like a bell. There was light in the darkness. There was kindness in this cold world. She wasn't entirely alone. As they walked back to the gloomy room, with the warm food bag in her hands and the shawl, now laden with new meaning, draped over her shoulders, Aisha felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A fragile yet real thread of hope. The room in Mrs. Muller's boarding house had never felt like home, but that night, after their visit to the market, it took on a different quality. The sweet aroma of the fruit Jean-Pierre had given them filled the small space, temporarily dispelling the musty, cabbagey smell. Aisha and Yasmin sat on the bed, sharing the most substantial meal they had had in weeks. Each bite of the crisp apple was pure ecstasy, each piece of soft, warm bread a balm for their hungry souls. For the first time, Yasmin's smile was genuine and carefree, her eyes shining with a light Aisha feared had been extinguished forever. In that moment, surrounded by the darkness of the room but warmed by that act of kindness, Aisha allowed herself to dream. Perhaps there was a chance. Perhaps she could find a job, perhaps they could find a better place, perhaps life could slowly rebuild itself from those fragments. She wrapped the shawl around Yasmin, who quickly fell asleep, her face smeared with apple juice and a sigh of contentment. Aisha stayed awake, listening to her daughter's regular breathing, feeling the familiar texture of the shawl under her fingers. Jean-Pierre's kindness wasn't just food, it was fuel for her hope. The next day, however, reality returned with all its brutal force. Mrs. Muller knocked on the door early in the morning, her face still a granite mask. "The week ends tomorrow," she announced bluntly. "Payment is due by 10 o'clock. No delays." The door closed, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than her words. Aisha looked at the handful of coins remaining in her purse. It was less than half of what she needed. The despair which had receded with Jean-Pierre's generosity rose again, stronger and more threatening than ever. What could she do? Where could she go? The image of the overcrowded and noisy shelter filled her with dread. Yasmin didn't deserve this. Nobody did. She spent the day walking the streets, asking in shops, cafes, anywhere that seemed like a possibility. "Do you need help?" she asked. Her hesitant pronunciation often met with impatient shakes or doors slammed in her face. In a restaurant, the boss, a large, sweaty man, laughed when she offered to wash dishes. "No papers, no work, dear. Go away." Each rejection was a nail in the coffin of her hope. The sky, which had been clear in the morning, began to darken again, promising another rainy night. Aisha returned to the room, her legs heavy as lead. Yasmin, sitting on the bed, silently played with the ends of her shawl. "Mom, are we going to stay here?" The innocent question was a knife. Aisha couldn't answer. She sat wobbly in the chair, staring at the empty wall. Night fell upon the city, and with it, a feeling of utter helplessness. She had survived a war, a perilous journey, hunger and cold. But would bureaucracy, indifference, the lack of a few banknotes, finally defeat her? She picked up the faded photograph of her husband. "What do I do, Karim?" she whispered to the silent image. "How do I keep it safe?" There was no answer, only the constant drip, 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 of the tap, marking the rhythm of her anguish. She fell asleep in the chair, exhausted, her head resting on the cold table, dreaming of markets full of colors and smiles that she could not reach. The day of the eviction had dawned. The sky was heavy, and a fine drizzle began to fall, a somber echo of the day she arrived. Aisha packed her few belongings into her backpack, her movements slow and heavy. Yasmin, sitting on the bed, seemed to understand that something was very wrong. She didn't speak, only observed her mother with serious eyes. Aisha looked out the window at the gray courtyard. This would be the last time she saw that place. It was a terrible place, but it was a roof over their heads. Now they wouldn't even have that. She took a deep breath, preparing to face Mrs. Muller and the impending eviction. The future was an impenetrable and frightening wall of fog. The sound came not as a knock, but as a trio of firm, decisive impacts on the bedroom door. Aisha froze, her hand hovering over the strap of her backpack. Her heart felt like it was going to burst from her chest. Mrs. Muller. It was time. The woman's punctuality was as cruel as her lack of empathy. Yasmin shrank back in bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Her eyes filled with a fear that broke Aisha's heart. "One moment," Aisha said, her voice a whisper. She straightened her shoulders, trying to gather a last fragment of dignity. She wouldn't cry. Not in front of that woman. She opened the door, already preparing the words of supplication in her mind. A last desperate plea for one more day, just one more day. But it wasn't Mrs. Muller. On the threshold, soaked by the fine drizzle falling from the leaden sky, stood a man. He was tall, wearing a simple dark coat, and his face was familiar. It took a second, a long second of silent confusion, for the circuits in her mind to connect. And then she saw it. The smile. It wasn't the same wide, carefree smile she'd seen under the bakery awning, but a more restrained, deeper smile that reached her eyes in a way that made the world stop. It was him. The man with the smile. The one whose simple gesture of human happiness had given her a breath of hope on her first day of despair. What was he doing here? How had he found her? Aisha's mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions. He held a small cloth bag, and his expression was a mixture of seriousness and intense gentleness. "Madam Aisha?" he asked, his voice warm and soft, a stark contrast to the coldness of the hallway. Aisha could only nod, speechless, her hand still firmly gripping the doorknob. He seemed relieved. "My name is Thomas," he said. I'm a friend of Jean-Pierre's. From the market." Jean-Pierre. The name echoed in Aisha's mind like a bell. The fruit man. Kindness. Understanding. Thomas continued, his gaze direct and honest. "He told me about you. About your daughter. About the shawl." He paused, his eyes moving quickly to Yasmin, who was now peeking out from behind her mother's leg, and then back to Aisha. "He's my uncle. Last night, he came to dinner at my house. He keeps talking about the dignity he saw in your eyes. About the strength." Aisha felt a heat rise in her face. She didn't feel strong. She felt fragile, broken. I don't understand," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "Why are you here?" Thomas took a deep breath, and a new kind of smile, one of determination, spread across his face. "Because I need help. And Jean-Pierre thinks you might be the right person." Aisha was even more confused. He needed help? Him? That man who seemed so solid, so integral a part of this world that rejected her? "I have nothing to offer," she whispered, shame burning in her veins. I don't even have a roof over my daughter's head after today." Thomas shook his head, a flash of pain in his eyes, as if her situation was a burden he also carried. "That's exactly what I want to talk about," he said. "Please, may I come in? Just for a moment." Aisha hesitated. Distrust was an old habit, a survival mechanism. But then she looked into his eyes. They were the same eyes that had smiled in the rain. They held the same humanity that had saved her from utter despair. She stepped away from the door, making room for him to enter. Thomas entered the small room, his presence seeming to fill the entire space. He looked around, his face showing no judgment, only a silent assessment. He knelt down to be at Yasmin's level. "Hello," he said softly. "You must be Yasmin. My uncle told me you really like apples." Yasmin, initially shy, nodded slowly, her wide eyes fixed on him. Thomas smiled at her, that same transformative smile, and Aisha saw the tension in her daughter's small body lessen slightly. He then stood up and turned to Aisha. "Jean-Pierre told me you're in trouble. And I have a problem that maybe we can solve together." He held up the cloth bag. "I own a cafe. A small cafe, not far from here. My manager, the person who took care of everything, suddenly had to move to take care of her family in another country. I'm desperate. The cafe is my livelihood, and I can't manage it alone." Aisha just looked at him, trying to process the words. "A cafe? A job offer? Was it possible?" I don't have experience," she said, her voice still a whisper. I don't know. Jean-Pierre said you're intelligent and willing to work, Thomas interrupted gently. That's all I need. Someone reliable. Someone with courage. You can learn. And, well, there's a small apartment. Right above the cafe. It's small, simple, but it's hot and dry. It would be available to whoever takes on the manager position. The words hung in the air between them, laden with such profound meaning that Aisha could barely comprehend it. A job. A roof over her head. A life. All offered by a stranger. By that stranger. The tears she had so painstakingly held back began to flow freely down her face, silent and unrestrained. She wasn't being fired. She was being saved. The walk to the cafe was a dream. Aisha walked beside Thomas, holding Yasmin's hand with a force that must have hurt, but the girl didn't complain. The drizzle had stopped, and the sun was trying to pierce the gray clouds, casting pale rays of light onto the cobblestone streets. Aisha could barely see the city around her. All she could think about were Thomas's words, echoing in her mind like a saving melody. Work, apartment, trust. They turned a corner and entered a narrower, more charming street, lined with small shops with colorful windows. And then he stopped. Here it is, said Thomas, with a touch of pride in his voice. The Café de Petits Miracles. The Café of Little Miracles. The name sounded like an omen in Aisha's heart. The facade was cozy, with large windows framed in dark wood and a wooden sign that swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, through the glass, she could see small wooden tables, comfortable chairs, and shelves full of books. There was a dark wood counter, and an old chrome coffee machine that gleamed under the warm lights. It felt like home. A place where people came to find comfort, to talk, to live. It was the complete opposite of the gloomy boarding house and the impersonal shelter. Thomas opened the door, and a bell tinkled softly. The smell that hit her was a revelation. Rich, earthy, the deep aroma of roasted coffee beans, mixed with the sweet scent of freshly baked cakes and vanilla. It was the smell of safety, of normalcy, of everyday happiness. Yasmin let out a silent, "Wow!" her wide eyes scanning the room. The interior was even more welcoming than it seemed from the outside. The walls were a soft yellow, decorated with black and white photographs of the city and paintings by local artists. There was a corner with cushions on the floor, and a small bookshelf of children's books. Thomas watched her reaction, a satisfied smile on his lips. "And now, the most important part," he announced, leading them to a discreet door beside the counter. He climbed a narrow, steep staircase and opened another door at the top. The apartment. It was, indeed, small. There was a living room that also served as a kitchen, a tiny bedroom, and a bathroom. But it was clean, it was bright, and it was incredibly warm. Sunlight streamed in through a window overlooking the busy street, illuminating the lightwood floor. There was a small sofa, a table, a double bed in the bedroom, and a charming crib in the corner, which Thomas explained had belonged to his former manager's niece. There was even a small green plant on a side table. To Aisha, it was a palace. It was everything. She walked to the middle of the room, her hands trembling. She touched the wooden table, felt the warmth of the heater, looked out the window at the life pulsating outside. This could be theirs. Really? Yasmin ran to the crib, climbed in, and lay down giggling. "Is this my bed, Mom?" Aisha couldn't answer. She turned to Thomas, tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of joy so pure it hurt. "Why?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Why would you do this for us?" Thomas looked at her, his expression serious. "Because once, many years ago, my family also needed help. Someone reached out to my mother. She always told me that kindness is a circle. We receive it, and it's our duty to pass it on when we can." He paused, his eyes soft. "And because when my uncle told me about you, I saw the same strength he saw. And I believe in people. I believe in second chances. This cafe, it's called Little Miracles for a reason. Sometimes miracles aren't big and loud. Sometimes they're small. Like finding the right person at the right time." He took a keychain with 2 keys from the cloth bag and placed it on the table. "These are yours. Work starts Monday if you want. We can work out the salary details later. It's fair, I promise. And the apartment is yours for as long as you work here. Aisha took the keys. They were cold and solid in her hand. They were the most real things she had touched in years. They represented not just a roof over her head and a job, but trust, dignity, and a future. She looked at Thomas, the man whose smile had anchored her in the storm, and who now offered her safe harbor. She had no words to express the gratitude overflowing from her being. All she could do was place her hand over her heart, a traditional gesture of deeply felt thanks.
Xinhao shukran xinhao, she whispered, the word laden with all the meaning in the universe.
Thank you. Thomas simply nodded, his smile, that smile, saying all that needed to be said. The circle of kindness was complete. The morning light streaming through the window of the small apartment wasn't the same pale, gray light of the boarding houses in her courtyard. It was golden, warm, and full of promise. Aisha woke with a strange and wonderful feeling of peace. For the first time in years, there wasn't a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She looked at Yasmin, still fast asleep in her crib, her face serene and flushed. The silence was welcoming, not oppressive. She got up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. People passed by, going to work, children going to school. She was no longer an invisible spectator of that life. She was part of it now. The apartment key was on the table, a small, bright symbol of her new reality. This would be her first day of work. Nervousness was natural, but it was overshadowed by a fierce determination. She put on the cleanest clothes she had, a simple pair of jeans and a blouse, and gently woke Yasmin. "Today is a great day, Habibti," she whispered, while brushing the girl's hair. "Mommy's going to work." Going downstairs to the cafe was like crossing a threshold into a new world. Thomas was already there, preparing the coffee machine. The smell was even more intense and inviting in the morning. He greeted her with a broad smile. "Good morning. Ready for your first day?" He spent the next few hours patiently showing her everything. The espresso machine, a chrome monster that spewed steam and produced a dark, aromatic liquid. The different types of beans, the names she was trying to memorize. Arabica, Robusta. The oven, where the croissants and golden panes au chocolate waited to be warmed. The cash register, simple to use. Aisha listened with absolute concentration, her eyes recording every movement, every detail. Her hands, which had previously trembled from cold and hunger, now trembled with excitement. She was afraid of making mistakes, of breaking something, of disappointing Thomas. But every time she looked at him, he encouraged her with a nod. "You can do it, Aisha. It's just practice." The bell on the door rang, and the first customer entered. It was an elderly lady in a red coat. Aisha froze. Thomas stepped forward. "Good morning, Madame Claudette." "The usual." He discreetly gestured for Aisha to take a croissant. With trembling hands, Aisha picked up the croissant with a spatula, placed it on a paper plate, and handed it over. "Thank you, dear," the lady said with a friendly smile before sitting down. It was a small success, but for Aisha, it was a monumental victory. She had served her first customer. Throughout the morning, she gained confidence. She learned how to serve coffee, how to make a basic cappuccino, how to handle money. The customers were mostly people from the neighborhood. Many of them already knew her story. Thomas, apparently, had told some of them, and the news had spread. They didn't treat her with pity, but with gentle curiosity and quiet respect. One man, a retired teacher named Monsieur Lapointe, spent some time chatting with Yasmin, who was sitting in the children's corner, coloring a drawing Thomas had given her. Aisha watched her daughter, normally so quiet and reserved, begin to blossom like a flower in the sun. She laughed, a crystalline, free laugh that filled the cafe with an even brighter light. At lunchtime, Thomas insisted she sit down and have a sandwich with him. "You're a quick learner, Aisha," he said, genuinely impressed. "The customers like you." The compliment warmed her inside more than any cafe could. She was no longer a refugee, a beggar, a nuisance. She was Aisha, the new manager of the Café de Petits Miracles. She belonged there. At the end of the day, when Thomas locked the door and they went up to the apartment, a happy exhaustion washed over Aisha. Her feet ached, her back ached, but her heart was light. She had worked. She had conquered that day. As she prepared Yasmin for bed, in her own bed, in her own room, in her own home, she looked around. The keys on the table. The smell of coffee rising softly from the floorboards. The gentle sound of her daughter's breathing. This wasn't survival. This was life. A life she was building with her own hands, with the help of an unexpected smile, and an act of kindness that changed everything. The long night was over. Dawn had finally arrived. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of Aisha's new life became a sweet, familiar melody. Waking to the sunlight, the smell of coffee rising from downstairs, the tinkling of the bell on the door, the familiar faces of customers now greeting her by name. She was no longer the trembling, frightened woman who had arrived in the rain. Her eyes, once deep and dark, now shone with a tranquil light. Her hands, which had once trembled from cold and hunger, now handled the heavy coffee machine with graceful confidence, creating small works of art with the milk foam for the younger customers. She had not only learned the trade, she had made it her own. She decorated the cafe with small Moroccan touches, a colorful glass jar of spices on the shelf, a dish towel embroidered with traditional patterns on the counter. The customers loved it. The cafe became even more welcoming, a piece of Mediterranean warmth in the heart of the European city. Thomas watched the transformation with a feeling of deep satisfaction. He was right about her. Her strength, her resilience, and her innate kindness were exactly what Café de Petits Miracles needed. It treated her as a partner, listening to her ideas. Like starting to sell some Moroccan sweets she made herself in her apartment, which became an instant success. For the first time, Aisha felt valued not despite who she was, but because of who she was. Her story, her culture, became part of the charm of the place, not a burden to be hidden. Yasmin was the greatest proof of this transformation. The quiet, timid girl had blossomed. She attended a local daycare in the mornings, and in the afternoons she stayed in the cafe's children's corner, making friends with the other children of the customers. Her French became fluent, mixed with the Arabic that Aisha insisted on speaking to her at home. She laughed, ran, and even had an adoptive grandmother, Madame Claudette, who always brought her a small sweet or a book. Aisha watched her daughter, her heart overflowing with grateful love. Yasmin would have a different childhood. She would have had security, education, happy memories. She would have had roots. One afternoon, while Aisha was setting the tables outside, she saw a woman in a worn coat with a lost look, standing on the corner, holding the hand of a small child. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. The exhaustion on the woman's face, the confusion in the child's eyes. It was her, a few months ago. Without hesitation, Aisha went into the cafe, grabbed 2 warm pains of chocolate and 2 glasses of orange juice that Thomas had just squeezed. She approached the woman, who instinctively recoiled, pulling the child closer. Aisha stopped at a safe distance and offered the snack with a gentle smile. "For the children," she said in simple French, gesturing to the girl. The woman's gaze shifted from distrust to cautious disbelief. She took the food, her slender fingers touching Aisha's. Shukran *, the woman whispered, the same word Aisha had said to Jean-Pierre. Aisha simply nodded, her smile saying, "I understand. Everything will be all right." She didn't have the words to explain, but she had the empathy to feel. She returned to the cafe, her heart heavy, yet light at the same time. The cycle continued. The kindness she had received now flowed through her. That night, sitting on the sofa in her apartment, with Yasmin fast asleep in the next room, Aisha picked up the shawl. She unwrapped it, its vibrant colors seeming even more vivid in the soft lamplight. She wrapped it around her shoulders, feeling the familiar weight and comfort it brought. But now, it was no longer a symbol of a lost past or a last resort of desperation. It was a symbol of her journey. From darkness to light. From hunger to plenty. From solitude to community. She was the same Aisha, but she was also a new Aisha. A survivor, a worker, a mother, a friend. She had found her place in the world. She had planted her roots in new foreign soil, and to her surprise, they were flourishing. The Café de Petits Miracles was more than a business. It was her home, her family, her second chance. And she would do anything to honor that gift. A year had passed since that rainy day when Aisha arrived in town. Autumn had painted the street trees in fiery hues, and the Café de Petits Miracles had become a beacon of warmth against the approaching cold. Aisha, now completely at ease in her role, had implemented a new idea. Every Thursday evening, the café transformed into a small cultural center. It was story night, where immigrants and locals gathered to share tales, music, and food from their homelands. On that particular Thursday, the main attraction was Aisha. She was going to tell a story. The café was packed. Regular customers, curious new faces, and even Jean-Pierre, the fruit vendor, was there, sitting in a corner with Thomas, his gentle face radiating pride. Yasmin, wearing a beautiful new dress, helped distribute pieces of semolina cake with orange blossom that Aisha had spent all afternoon preparing. The air was thick with anticipation, and the sweet aroma of cake and coffee. When it was Aisha's turn, a respectful silence fell over the room. She stood in the center of the café, the Moroccan shawl, her shawl, draped over her shoulders like a cloak of courage. She didn't look at the people as a crowd, but as individuals, many of whom had become her friends. She took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was clear and calm, without a trace of the hesitation of a year ago. She didn't tell a tale from the Arabian Nights. She told her story. She spoke of the Marrakesh sun and the smell of spices in the market. She spoke of the sound of airplanes and the pain of losing everything. She spoke of the overcrowded boat, the fear, the hunger. She spoke of arriving in the relentless rain, the exhaustion that threatened to consume her. And then, she paused, her eyes meeting Thomas's. And she told of a smile. A simple smile from a stranger under the awning of a bakery. She described that moment with such vivid precision that everyone in the room could see it. She spoke of how that gesture of pure human happiness, so distant from her reality, anchored her. It gave her a thread of hope to cling to. She continued, recounting the hunger, the attempt to sell the shawl, and Jean-Pierre's kindness. "He didn't just give me food," she said, her voice slightly choked. "He told me to keep my shawl. He restored my dignity." And then, she told of the knock on the door on the day of the eviction. Of the appearance of Thomas, the smiling man, bringing not only a job offer and a home, but bringing confidence and a future. She presented herself not as a victim, but as a witness. A witness to the power of human kindness. "A smile can save a life," she said, her tears flowing freely now, but they were tears of healing. "A piece of fruit can nourish a soul. An act of trust can rebuild a world." She looked at Thomas, at Jean-Pierre, at Madame Claudette, at all the faces in the room. "You showed me that home isn't a place on a map. It's where kindness lives. And I found my home here with you." When she finished, there was no immediate applause. There was a deep, moved silence, broken by the soft sob of a woman in the audience. And then the applause began, not loud and effusive, but slow, steady, full of respect and emotion. Thomas stood and went to her, embracing her. "Thank you, Aisha," he whispered, "for sharing your light." That night, when the last client left and Yasmin was put to bed, Aisha stood at the apartment window, looking out at the silent street. She thought about the long, winding road that had brought her there. The pain, the loss, the fear, they were still part of her, scars on her soul. But they no longer defined her. What defined her was the resilience, the gratitude, and the love she had found in the most unexpected place. She picked up the faded photograph of her husband. "We're okay, Karim," she whispered to the night. "Yasmin is safe. She's happy. And I'm happy too." She placed the photo back on the table next to the apartment key. The circle of kindness that had saved her wasn't a closed circle. It was a wave that expanded, touching the lives of everyone in the café, on the street in the city. And Aisha, the heartbroken Moroccan refugee, had become its most powerful bearer. She had arrived exhausted, but a smile took her breath away and, in the process, gave her a new life to breathe. A life that, at last, was worth living.